Kia ora koutou. For this talk, if I can get it to move, I'm going to ask whether shipwreck eruptions are getting bigger in cold forests at high elevations, and if so, what mechanisms are driving that trend. So we care because high elevation beech forests are strongholds, they're thermal refuges with usually few predators for many endemic forest bird species such as kea, mohua, tokoeka, kakariki, rifleman. Intermittent beech mast seeding triggers rodent eruptions, which puts the species in those thermal refuges at risk of predation. And there's also the strong likelihood that shipwreck eruptions up high in those thermal refuges are going to get bigger as the climate warms, and there are hints of that trend already. So in this map of pure beech forests, the colours are six zones of mean annual temperature. Just try and get a laser pointer up here, these six zones. And I'm just going to use these six zones and these six colours throughout the talk. The blues are colder places. They represent the thermal refuges. And the warmer colours are the warmer zones. A key point to note in these temperature patterns is that valleys extending deep into mountains mean that cold, high elevation thermal refuges are not islands. They're continuous with, and in many places, they're not very far from warmer, lower elevation forests. And warmer forests down, often near valley floors on the low slopes, are more ratty most or all of the time. So this plot shows how shipwrecks have tracked in those six zones in the absence of management across a 17-year time series to autumn 2022. So these are median predictions of unmanaged tracking rates for each zone from models that I fitted to DOC's huge tracking data set together with Greater Wellington Regional Council's data set. It's massive. They show the median patterns in the data that I'm going to interrogate in the rest of this talk to try and understand what's driving high elevation shipwreck eruptions and why they may be getting bigger. There's a spread of values around each line that are just too messy to show here. So these are just the median trends. There will be values all over the place. But as you can see, shipwrecks are usually more active where it's warmer. They dominate in warmer places lower down, and they are usually much less active, in fact, almost off the scale in the coldest thermal refuges. There's a predictable cycle in shipwreck tracking rates that you can see in response to mast seed fall event. Here I've just pulled out a random one. I think this is 2014. So beech flowers in the spring, seed starts falling in the summer, and rodent tracking rates typically start to climb in the autumn, and they climb right through and usually peak in the following summer after the beech seed germinates, because the populations overshoot and you've got many frantic and hungry rats running around at the end of the bonanza and tracking tunnels, whether or not their densities have started to decrease or not. So we've identified 7 eruptions in this time series, and the grey bars show the periods that there was likely beech seed available that triggered those eruptions. And while we're here, I'm going to point out that a quirk of the data is that the records, and therefore the predictions we could confidently make just to get this time series, unfortunately don't go back as far in truly cold forests. So we've got shorter time series in these dark blue colours, just 3 eruptions represented in the coldest forests, these 5 to 6s here, and 6 of the 7 eruptions in the second coldest zone, the 6 to 7 degree zone. The tracking rates show that high elevation shipwreck eruptions, these blue colours, did get bigger over time, at least over the period of records, the ones we know about. So in the coldest beech forest, the biggest eruption followed the 2019 seed fall, and those are the dark blue peaks in the biggest red circle on this slide. And the second biggest high elevation eruption that we know of was in 2014. So as I said, unfortunately, we didn't have tracking tunnels up high in 2016, which, as you can see, was pretty large in warmer forests. So my bets would be that this was one that was very similar in magnitude. However, we don't know. But we can still ask the data what mechanisms were driving those bigger eruptions later in the time series, having answered the first question of, are they getting bigger? Yes, they appear to be. So there are at least three possible explanations for bigger shipwreck eruptions. More seed, more rats to begin with up high, or more rats to begin with down low. So the first explanation, maybe the ship rats were just responding to a lot more food. This is an intuitive idea. If you have a big mast event with a lot of seedfall, even low density populations of rats are able to grow faster and reach really high population or very large population sizes. So they give us large, very high tracking rates. Second, maybe there were few more rats to begin with up high in those cold forests, maybe because winters aren't so severe anymore, or maybe there's more food around all year round for rats to survive on. So when seed arrives, the populations start their exponential growth from a higher base, and those small initial differences, even though there are a few rats to begin with, a small difference can magnify into a much bigger high elevation eruption. The third explanation is maybe there were more rats hanging out down low before seedfall, and it's here that eruptions started from a higher base and got so much bigger. And then what we got was density dependent immigration because the low forests got especially crowded and rats left for less crowded feeding grounds upslope. So there was immigration. So Joe Carpenter and others have showed for the first time that there must have been upslope immigration in the eruption of ship rats at Lake Alabasta after the last mass seedfall event. So that was 2019. And those of you who were with us then may remember Dean's talk in our last workshop. That's still up on our website if you want to go back and have a look at it. So in this plot from that talk, which is now published, the red dots are the shipwreck densities that they observed through time at high elevations. And you can see that there's this huge peak in the summer of 2020. The black lines are fitted trends from their models. And this is and the confidence intervals. And so this is from their best model, which allowed for immigration from lower down. Their model with immigration fitted their observed data best, whereas a model without allowing for upslope immigration, this lower plot greatly underestimated how many rats would result, especially in the summer of 2020. And you can see that the lines don't describe the observed data peak at all well. They're pretty much flat. In fact, there were 4 times as many rats as would have been expected if they couldn't and didn't move up the hill. To test our 3 different explanations, we fitted models to our predicted unmanaged tracking rates across the multiple eruptions in each temperature zone. And to represent the amount of beech seed in an eruption, in these models, we used a climate correlate called delta T as a proxy. So I'm not going to go into those details, and we know it's not a perfect proxy, but we know from field measurement that delta T is generally correlated with the amount of seedfall. Here I've plotted delta T on the y-axis against the mean annual temperature across the beech forest. You can see we had a humongous year in 2019. We had 2 pretty pathetic years in 2009 and 2011, and a bunch in the middle. But there should have been some difference in the seedfall amount across these different years. So does seedfall quantity determine the size of eruptions? Well, somewhat surprisingly, we found that the amount of seed, or at least its proxy delta T, which is shown here along the horizontal line, did not have that much effect on shipwreck eruptions up high. So here are the effects fitted for the 3 coldest classes, the blues. The lines show how shipwreck tracking in the spring of the eruption varied in response to seedfall along the bottom, and an upward slope is a positive relationship. More seedfall, more rats, and these slopes are not particularly steep, and those effects are not very big. In fact, in high cool forests, even after the biggest seedfall difference that we know of between 2009 and 2019, the model predicts only a 1 to 2% increase in ship rats up high, and I think this is the second coolest zone where we've got those 6 eruptions. So the quite modest effects suggest the amount of seed is unlikely to be the only explanation for bigger ship rat eruptions up high. For completeness, here the effect of seedfall fitted in the warmest forest was also quite small. So in the warmest valley floor zone, we'd expect just a 3 to 4% difference in shipwreck tracking rates following, between the smallest and largest seedfall events we know of. So seedfall quantity overall had quite modest effects on eruptions according to our results. So what about the resident ship rats at high elevation? Were there more rats to begin with up high just before seedfall, which then grew exponentially in situ to drive the bigger eruptions up high? And the answer, as a spoiler, is no. So here I've plotted the population takeoff points, how many rats there were to begin with, as indexed by their tracking rates just before the last 7 eruptions, just as the beech was flowering. So you can see that ship rats at these takeoff points at these times always tracked very much higher to begin with in the warm forests than in the cold high forests. That's usual. And they did increase quite substantially in the warm valley floor beech forests later on in that time series. They were obviously pretty high before the 2006 eruption, but they were at their highest before 2019. But in the coal forest, there was no evident trend. And to even see this, I've had to expand the lower part of the plot in this big red box because tracking rates in high cold forests just before seedfall were almost always extremely low, medians of less than 2%, 1 to 2%. And unlike in the warm forest, you can see a pretty flat line. There was nothing very unusual about 2018, just before that mast, or 2013. So not surprisingly, we found that the resident population had little effect on high elevation eruptions. At least tracking rates to begin with in situ up high were not a strong predictor of the size of eruptions up high. So here again, we've got the 3 coldest forest zones, and on the horizontal axis is tracking rate to begin with in that zone before seedfall. And the lines show how shipwreck tracking rate varied in the spring of the eruption 12 months later. So this is a year later. And these blobs here are the extremes, the 95th percentiles, values of rats to begin with in the second coldest zone again. And we found that even if there were extraordinarily high numbers of rats to begin with up high, a 38% tracking rate when usually it's less than 2, this would lead to an eruption only 1 to 2% bigger. So it's clear we can't lay much blame for bigger eruptions up high on bigger resident rat populations up there. But it's a very different story down low in the warmer beech forests. So we found that the size of eruptions in warmer, lower, often valley floor, lower slope beech forests was really strongly correlated with the number of rats present to begin with in that same warm zone. So this is a huge effect. It's pretty much 1 to 1. And that provides a clue when we're trying here to explain the high elevation eruptions, and we're left with our third potential explanation that more rats to begin with down low and the subsequent big eruptions down low may be triggering immigrations from low to high. That is, rats get to such high densities down low that they're boiling over and moving up the hill. So we now know that neither seedfall nor rats to begin with up high fully explain bigger high elevation shipwreck eruptions. Something else has to be the reason that 2014 and 2019 were so much bigger than, say, 2016. And in our models, this is the unique year effect, the something else peculiar to an eruption year, which is not seedfall and it's not rats to begin with. So on this plot, we're looking at the eruptions in the very coldest forests, and the contribution of something else is shown in these yellow polygons. And the main thing to note is that something else is by far the largest contributor to the higher rat tracking rates in those 2014 and 19 eruptions compared to 2016. Those contributions start, and I've plotted them here, from the summer of seedfall through to the peak, and at all stages, but especially at those peaks, the yellow something else dwarfs the tiny contributions of rats to begin with in the black, and the contributions of seedfall size in the grey. And it's the same story in the zone just below. These are the 6 to 7 degree forests just under the coldest zone, where we had good tracking data from the last 6 eruptions, and the smallest eruption was in 2011. Again, it was something else, not rats to begin with, and not seedfall, that contributed to the higher tracking rates in those other eruptions. We suspected that the something else, which mainly drove the big high elevation eruptions, might be more rats to begin with in warmer forests down low in the springs when the beech flowered. And a post hoc comparison really backs up that suspicion. So here, rats to begin with in the warm, low elevation forests along the bottom, and that unique year effect, that something else, is up here. And you can see that the year effect, the big source of variation, which we need to explain in each eruption, is strongly correlated, positively correlated with the tracking rates of ship rats to begin with down low. We used Graham's fancy pants sea log models, so we could estimate daily population growth rates of ship rats through the eruptions in these models. And as the plots show, daily population growth rates here on the y-axis, where we've still got tracking rate to begin with down low, is also really very strongly correlated with how many rats there were to begin with down low. So what this is saying is that shiprat populations always grow faster up high in those years when low elevation shiprat tracking rates at the start of the eruption are higher in the low elevation forests. So our results suggest that the amount of seed makes a small but definite contribution to the size of eruptions up high, but it is small, whereas how many rats were up there to start with makes virtually no difference at all. And our results suggest that it's the number of rats down low between the masts and at the start of the seed fall that is the big driver. So we've shown that high numbers of rats to begin with down low generate much bigger eruptions down low, which we assume then leads to more immigration upslope. And to conclude with then, in beech forests, our results support the idea that larger shiprat populations in warm forests at low elevations may be a really key driver of bigger eruptions in high elevations. In fact, that may have a much bigger effect than the amount of seed. And if this is true, then it suggests that a focus on controlling shiprats at lower elevations between and before masts could help to protect forest birds in high, cold thermal refuges under climate change. And that's my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. We've got a couple of minutes. We have a question here from Graham Lowe. Hi, Susan. What was happening on the mouse front?
You'll have to wait for another talk for that, Graham. Yeah. I can't actually remember at this moment, but yeah, I think you'll just have to wait for another talk.
Susan, your data show the intermast rat populations, they increased in the lower, warmer forest over the time period of your data, but that wasn't the case up high. Why do you think there was that difference?
It's a good question. It may be that the forests down low are responding more rapidly, I think, to climate warming. We know that we had a number of really warm years and a number of really warm winters. But it may be that the sort of more resource poor forests up high are just not able to increase productivity to support shiprats as fast as the lower forests. So it may be that we see climate change effects or warming effects more quickly down low. It may be that the changes up high are still to come.
Okay, and just the final comment in your talk about possibly controlling rats lower down before they have a chance to move up top. Are you thinking that that would be practicably achievable with, say, aerial 1080, for example?
I'm not a manager, John, but yeah, I mean, it sort of says that if you have a beech mast and it doesn't matter how much seed you've got, if these results are correct, and we always try and break these results because you really want to test them hard, then what matters and what managers may be wanting to think about is like, where have we got big shiprat populations down low? Because we need to get onto these before the seed falls. Otherwise, we're really going to have a problem. So I think, yeah, I hope that answers your question. But I think, you know, doing those aerial operations between the masts, and you saw the shape of those plots, it shows like you wouldn't actually need to get them down to zero even to make a big difference. And so, yeah, that's, I guess, where that's leading us.